Hey everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of chapter 8 in Psych 4100. In this second half of chapter 8, we will be discussing the constructive nature of memory, and specifically common types of errors, such as what we're going to call source monitoring errors, and then outright false memories. And then we're going to end with the implication for source monitoring errors and false memories for eyewitness testimony. So, as we saw at the end of part 1, um, even when people have extremely intense, emotional, vivid memories of experiences like a flashbulb memory, even in these incredibly vivid, specific, highly focused emotional events, people still begin over time to make errors in their memories for those events. What this suggests as a sort of a general and overall principle that applies to just the global understanding of human memory is that memory is constructive. Memory is not an exact, perfect recording of what happened. Memory is not a sort of perfectly sealed videotape that will exist forever and can be played back a million times, giving you the same results. That's not how memory works. Memory is subject to change over time. It's subject to degradation and the loss of information. It's subject to reconstruction and the inclusion of information that should never have been there. So, really, what ends up happening is that memory becomes a combination of what actually happened, so sort of the true core of what the memory should be, but then people add on top of it this sort of extraneous information based upon their own knowledge, experiences, and expectations, in addition to maybe factors of the situation. So we have the situation, the true sort of memory of what actually happened, and someone's prior knowledge, experience, and expectations, all sort of interacting to construct a memory. We can see this very clearly and easily in a very simple experiment. In this memory experiment, some researchers, this is called the War of the Ghosts experiment. It's a sort of a, I don't want to call it a fairy tale, a sort of cultural iconic story from a non-Western culture about a war between ghosts. Right? It's sort of an important cultural piece of information. People were told this story, and they attempted to remember the story to the best of their abilities. And then they repeatedly had to reproduce the story. So you hear the story on day one, and then later in day one, you have to repeat the story. And then later, you have to repeat the story again. And then maybe the next day, you have to repeat the story again. You have to repeatedly repeat the story. What ends up happening is that people start to change the story over time. It becomes shorter with fewer details. People start omitting information and then adding in inaccuracies. And furthermore, people start to change the story in sort of interesting and subtle ways to make the story fit sort of better with their own cultural conceptualization of the way that things should be happening. Obviously, different cultures have sort of different ideals, different expectations about narratives, about the way that people or things should interact with one another, the degree to which cultures sort of are accepting or not accepting of things like ghosts and the supernatural. And so what ends up happening is that people in subtle ways start to completely change the story so that after repeated reproductions, the story looks very different from the original story that was told. So, what this suggests is that people are not simply recording the story and replaying it. People are adding in their own elements, maybe not on purpose, right? It's not like people are trying explicitly to screw up the story. It's just that our memory systems are constructive or reconstructive. They're flexible, they're inaccurate, that tries to fill in the gaps and do its best job possible. One of the very common errors that can be made over time in memory has to do with source monitoring. So, source memory is understanding the origins of your memories. Where did you experience this information? Where did it come from? Who told you the information? Did you experience it? Did a friend tell you? Did your parents tell you? Right? What is the source of the information? A source monitoring error is when we make a misattribution of the source. So, for example, and we're going to use this example a couple times. In part one, I brought up my very early memory of being stuck and lost on an elevator as a young child. So, it's possible that I'm making a source monitoring error when I say that I remember that event, because maybe I don't actually remember that event. Maybe it was just my mother telling me the story, as sort of we discussed. So that would be a source monitoring error, because I'm claiming to remember it, but in reality, the source of that information was just my mother telling me the story. This has really interesting implications for things like plagiarism. And this is known as cryptomnesia, which is unconscious plagiarism of someone else's work due to a lack of recognition of its original source. How can you unknowingly plagiarize? I think probably the easiest way to think about this is in terms of music. There's only so many notes, there's only so many beats or rhythms or time signatures and patterns, chord sequences. And so, what often happens when musicians create a song is that it might sort of be made up of elements of previous songs that they have heard from other artists. This would not be the same thing as like explicitly sampling someone's work, right? That's different. That's knowingly using someone's drum beat or someone's guitar riff, which is fine because you give them credit, you pay them for it, whatever. Everyone's cool with it, right? Because you're sampling. This would be I'm sitting down with my guitar, writing my own album, and I sort of accidentally write a song that's exactly the same as a song that I heard 5 years ago. But I have a source monitoring error. I don't remember the source of that information. I think I'm just coming up with this pattern, with this chord progression. But as it turns out, I'm actually unconsciously plagiarizing someone else's music. Now, don't think that you can get away with this and use cryptomnesia as an excuse for plagiarizing in school. Not exactly what we're talking about, although it could apply in some cases to academic work. It is still incumbent upon you, the student, to make sure you are not plagiarizing. But it is an interesting implication out in the real world of source monitoring errors. Another really interesting or an interesting experiment that shows us something about source monitoring errors is some work by Jacoby and colleagues in 1989, where people were given a series of names. Some of them were names of famous people, and some of them were names of just random names, not famous people. often when people were hearing these names, they would identify the non-famous names as being famous people because participants misattributed the familiarity of hearing that name again with that person being famous. So we'll set up the experiment. On day one, you get a bunch of names, and your job is to remember those names. Some of them are famous people, and some of them are just random names, right? So you get this long list of names. Some are famous people, some are random names. You study that list, you do your best to remember it. You come back the next day, 24 hours later, and they give you the same list. And you look over the list, and your job is to identify who's famous and who's not famous. What ends up happening is that on day two, people make errors and they identify the random non-famous names as occasionally being famous people. They said, yeah, that name is familiar. That's a famous person. I can't remember, is it an actor? Is it a musician? Is it a TV personality? I can't remember, but I know that's a famous person. When in fact, it's just a random name. What's happening is that they are having a failure of source monitoring. They are confusing the familiarity of having seen the name 24 hours ago with that person actually being famous. So they feel a sense of familiarity because it's a name they saw the previous day, but they confuse that familiarity for the person being famous rather than appropriately and accurately attributing their memory to it simply being a name that was on the list the day prior. So they read non-famous names, and then they read the non-famous names with new non-famous names and famous names, and then they misattribute those non-famous names to being an actual famous person because they lose track of where they heard or saw the name from. So what this means and can unfortunately lead to is something called the illusory truth effect. It's very similar to the propaganda effect, which we discussed earlier, where stimulus repetition leads you, in this case, in the illusory truth effect, to evaluating something as being true simply because you have repeatedly seen it. This is occurring due to your familiarity with the information. And because it's familiar, you attribute it to being true. This is obviously going to be a very often used tactic for politicians who want to try and get you to believe in something that is in fact not true. If they just say it enough times, then it becomes true, particularly probably to their followers or those inclined to follow them. Another interesting sort of twist on memory is that memory often involves us making inferences that may or may not be appropriate from the information to be remembered. So, first, inferences are conclusions that people draw based on their experiences and knowledge, right? We talked about how your prior experience and knowledge can have an impact on how you construct memories. And so people make assumptions about information to be remembered, particularly perhaps when like filling in missing gaps of knowledge. And so memory often includes information that has been implied or assumed based on the inferences that people make, even though that information was never explicitly stated and was never actually in the memory. So let's return back to my memory of being in an elevator, getting lost and stuck in an elevator. My memory of that event is that when the doors opened and I was alone on the elevator and the elevator stopped and the doors opened, I remember there being a group of people there sort of watching and waiting for me. They didn't know that I was coming up the elevator. They're just waiting on the elevator, minding their own business. The doors open. This group of people tries to get on the elevator, but there's this random little lost kid, me, on the elevator. I actually don't know if that's true or not. It could have very easily just been a single person. It could have easily been just a couple, right? But I remember it as it being sort of a big group of people waiting to get on the elevator. This could just be an assumption, an inference I'm making based upon schemas or scripts that I have from prior experience about the way that people function in big hotels on elevators. So when you're in a big hotel and there's a lot of sort of traffic going up and down, especially at busy times, people tend to congregate at the elevators, right? It's like a choke point. And so you end up with, crowds of people, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people waiting on the elevator. That's a very common aspect of being in a big, large, high-rise hotel sort of elevator situation. There's a prior knowledge about that aspect of the environment that I am bringing to the memory. It very well could not be true. That might be a complete fabrication on my part, even though that's what I remember. It simply could be me making an inference, an assumption based upon my schema or sort of the general idea of how elevators work. And so in reality, I don't remember how many people were standing there looking at me. I have no idea how many people there were. My brain just fills in the gap with what my brain thinks was probably there. And what my brain thinks was probably there was a big group of people, even though that might not have been the case. We can also fill in gaps based on scripts. So I want you to imagine that you have a memory of the sequence of events of your let's make it interesting, your 21st birthday, right? So you might actually have some memory impairment from ingesting alcohol, as many people do to excess on their 21st birthday. I was unable to do that because I had a neuroscience exam the next day. But many people do. It's very common. And so you could have this sort of memory of the way that evening went, right? We started out going out for sushi. There was a group of us, so we had to wait to get a table. And then we sat down and we all ordered. We got these big boats and platters of sushi for the whole table. Then we went out to, another bar or a nightclub, and we took a taxi home. You have this sort of memory for the sequence of events. It's possible that that's not exactly what happened, because what your brain is doing is just filling in the gaps of a quote unquote night out script. And it's filling the gaps where you have blanks, right? Where you don't remember what happened. Because maybe, maybe instead of having to wait for a table at the sushi restaurant, maybe you actually got right in because it wasn't as busy as you expected. Right? Maybe someone called ahead and actually made a reservation, but your brain says, well, we went out to sushi with 12 people. We probably had to wait for a table, right? That's how it usually works. That's the quote unquote script for going out with a big group. And so what your brain does is it knows the standard sequence of events. It compares that standard sequence of events to your memory. And then anytime there's a gap in your memory, it fills that gap with what it expects or assumes should have been there based upon the typical script. So this is basically what I just said. Your memories can include information that was actually never experienced, but was simply inferred because it is consistent with schemas or scripts. So at this point, it seems like memory is actually kind of a terrible system, right? This seems extremely problematic. And it is, but there are some advantages to this constructive nature of your memories. It does allow you to fill in the blanks and, probably get as close to being correct as you can. It allows you to be sort of flexible and creative in the way that you understand people's language or problem solve or make decisions. And imagine the trouble you would run into if you were listening to someone talk and you missed a word, right? There was a car horn or someone was screaming down the street and it distracted you and you missed a word in the conversation. And the missing of that word completely shuts down your memory system because now, there's a blank, right? There's a gap in the memory. I don't know what the fourth word of that sentence was. It would be debilitating if every time there was a little blip in a memory, then the system just shut down and said, that memory is no good because it's not perfect, right? If any imperfect memory got just thrown away and was unusable, we would have really, really big problems with problem solving, understanding language, making decisions. The flexible, constructive nature of memory allows you to make an assumption about what that word was that you missed, fill in the blank, fill in the gap, and just smoothly proceed on with the conversation and with the interaction. So there are real advantages to this constructive nature, of course, as well as there being disadvantages. You're going to make errors. You're going to misattribute the source of information. You're going to omit or include inappropriate information. And so as long as we understand the sort of give and take, the pros and cons of this constructive nature of memory, it's okay. We can deal with it. We can study it. We can know what happens, and we can behave appropriately. So from here on out, we're going to discuss sort of outright memory errors and what we know about false memories and memory errors. The first kind of error being the misinformation effect. This is when misleading information after an event occurs changes how that person later describes the event. This is very relevant for things like eyewitness memory. So imagine you witness an event, maybe a crime, and you have a memory of that event. Then maybe you're talking to other witnesses. Maybe you're talking to lawyers or the police or someone who's interviewing you. And somewhere along the way, you run into misinformation. You run into someone who contradicts you. You run into someone who suggests something to you that's counter to your memory. And it can actually change your description of the event and your memory. This is called misleading post-event information, MPI. And we actually have lots of studies on this. They started really back in the 70s, in particular with a very famous memory researcher named Elizabeth Loftus. She's considered the foremost authority on eyewitness testimony and false memory in the world. She has some great TED Talks. If this interests you, I would highly recommend just YouTubing her, Elizabeth Loftus, maybe False Memory, or Elizabeth Loftus Eyewitness Testimony, and you'll get a whole slew of fantastic resources from her. She's really great. But she did some early experiments in this area where people, for example, saw a traffic accident, and they're seeing a slide of an intersection that has a traffic accident, and that intersection had a stop sign. However, the researchers subtly introduce the misinformation that it was actually a yield sign. So in reality, it was a stop sign, but the researchers sort of on the sly introduced the information that it was in fact a yield sign. And so what happens is many participants adjust and change their memory to claim that it was in fact a yield sign, which was not true, and that they never saw a stop sign, which they actually did. Now, this is a very controlled environment. It's in a laboratory, but you can imagine the implications here of witnessing a crime, witnessing a car accident. It might really matter whether witnesses claim, was the light green, yellow, or red? Did that person yield and when they were making a right-hand turn, or did they not? Right? Was the person in the crosswalk there when they should have been or when they should not have been? These things matter a lot, potentially for lawsuits, for sending people to jail, for liability, and certain people having to pay for the damage or injury of others. Another great example that Loftus showed, and you can get people to change their memory based on very subtle misinformation, was that they again used a car accident example. And for some of the participants, the car accident was described with the sort of neutral language of two cars hit each other. For other participants, the accident was described with this more emotionally inflammatory language. The cars smashed into each other. And when participants then gave their eyewitness testimony of the event, those that had heard the word smashed claimed that the cars were going much faster than the group that heard the word hit. So think about this again in the context of you witness a car accident and you're being interviewed by the police. How easy would it be for a police officer? Maybe they're not even trying to influence you, right? Let's just assume that the police officer is completely neutral here. They don't have any skin in the game. They don't care. They're just trying to take your honest statement. And they use the word, okay, so when you saw the cars smash into each other, what happened? Or can you describe how the cars smashed into each other? Or can you describe where the cars were when they smashed into each other? They could be very innocently using that language, but that suggestion, that information of this sort of emotional valence of the word smashed can have a remarkable impact on your memory of the event, such that you make claims about, for instance, the speed of the cars that might not be correct and might not be necessary. And of course, we can have source monitoring errors as suggesting certain information to people. This is a really cool experiment from 1990 where people heard a story, and then 2 days later, they heard the same story, but it had a couple details that were changed, and they were told to ignore the changes. So they are told to focus on repeating the original story. When the original story and then the 2-day later story, when they had the same voice, so for example, a woman and then the same woman reading the story, it led to errors in source monitoring. People attributed these changed details back to the original story, versus if the voice changed from the original day to 2 days later, if it went from a female to a male voice, it created fewer errors. So on day one, we have people who watched a slideshow of someone stealing a computer. And when the people heard a misleading narrative from a female, which was the same female as the original slides, they ended up with fewer errors. Than when they heard I said that wrong. When the voices matched, so when on day one they had a female narrator, and then at the next point in time they also had a female narrator, they made more errors. That they had more of that misinformation. When the gender of the narrator changed, when we went from a female narrator to a male narrator, they made fewer errors because the change from female to male makes it obvious about this was source 1 and this was source 2. Whereas when they're both female, it makes things more difficult and we get more source monitoring errors. Okay, so all of those experiments were about taking real memories and changing them in subtle ways through the power of suggestion. But we can go a step further. There have been experiments starting back in the mid-90s, a particularly famous one, where researchers were able to implant completely false memories into college students. So let me explain this procedure. The researchers selected, a random sampling of, let's just say, 100 college students to be in their study. And before the students came into the lab, the researchers contacted the parents of those 100 college students. And what they asked for were 2 stories, true stories from that student's childhood. So it could be anything, a beach vacation that the family took, the time that their house burned down, right? Anything. They asked the parents for 2 true real life stories from the student's childhood. Then the researchers took a fake story and inserted it with the 2 true stories. The fake story was typically something like going to Disney World and interacting with certain characters there, Daffy Duck, Donald Duck, whatever, right? So when the student comes to sit down in the lab, they think that they're going over true stories from their own childhood. 2 of the stories are real, true events from the student's childhood. The third one, the one about going to Disney World, is completely fake and fabricated. It was made up by the experimenters. And in fact, they confirmed with the parents of the students that something like this had never happened to the student as a child. So the researcher sits down with the student and they say, oh, we have these, we're memory researchers. We have these 3 stories that your parents told us about events from your childhood. we'd like if you could talk with us about them and maybe try and remember all the details that you can remember about these 3 events from your childhood. And so, of course, the students are perfectly good at remembering the 2 true events, and they talk and talk and talk about the true events. But then some of the students even went on and on and on about their memory for the fake event. They essentially developed a completely fabricated false memory that they claimed to remember having happened to them, that their parents confirmed has never actually happened. A completely implanted false memory. And so this obviously is problematic for things like eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is incredibly convincing. Someone stands up in a court of law and they point their finger and they say, he did it, Your Honor. That's the man that robbed my house. And it's extremely convincing to a jury, right? You're sitting here listening to a person tell this horrible, terrible story about when they were attacked or when they were robbed or when their car was stolen. And they're saying that person right over there, that defendant is the one who did it. How could they be wrong? Right? How could that happen? That it happened to them, right? They are the victim. They were staring at the face of their attacker. And so if they're going to stand here in a court of law and swear that it was the defendant, then we must believe them, right? Eyewitness testimony is incredibly powerful. However, just like any other type of memory, eyewitness testimony can often be inaccurate. It can be completely fabricated, and it can, in particular, be open to suggestion, source monitoring errors, things of that nature, which lead to mistaken identity and lead to what we find over much of the last 20 to 25 years as DNA evidence has sort of come to the forefront of policing is that we've put a lot of innocent people in jail, like a lot of innocent people. In fact, once Elizabeth Loftus really started to dig into this area of memory research, she works with things like the Innocence Project or organizations like the Innocence Project, which goes around and tries to represent and get these people out of jail who were convicted based only on eyewitness testimony, and then exonerate them using modern DNA evidence. And they've pulled people off of death row, people who are on death row for things like rape and murder, who were completely innocent and were put there because of eyewitness testimony and incorrect eyewitness testimony. So it's really sort of troubling and really difficult to sort of comprehend and contend with in the legal system. But if you would talk to most memory researchers, they would tell you that never again should we convict someone only based on eyewitness testimony. If we're going to convict someone of a crime, we need some other kind of evidence. We need video, we need audio, we need DNA, we need something to corroborate the eyewitness testimony, because it's just too risky. We've put too many innocent people in jail simply because of eyewitness testimony. And of course, there's experiments that show this. People in a group of participants in 1998 watched a security tape of a gunman who was robbing a store, and the gunman was in full view on the video for 8 seconds. And then these participants engaged in something that would be very common, which would be a criminal lineup, right? That the police might do. Here's, a row of 5 or 6 suspects. Can you look through and can you tell us which one was the gunman? every single participant pointed someone out as being the gunman who was from the lineup. Every single participant picked someone as being the gunman, even though the real gunman was not pictured or was not presented in the lineup at all. So the actual gunman from the video was not present in the lineup, yet every participant picked someone from the lineup and claimed that they were the gunman. This probably has just as much to do with memory as it does things like social expectations. So imagine that you witness a robbery, you give your statement to the police, they call you in a week later, 2 weeks later. That's problematic because now we know you've had time for that memory to degrade. But they call you in and they say, here's our criminal lineup. Who was the robber? Who was the gunman? Well, you don't want to. There's this sort of undercurrent of social expectation where the police have done all this work. Surely the actual true gunman is here somewhere. I don't want to disappoint the police, right? I want to catch the bad guy. I want to help. I want the person who did this to be behind bars. I want them punished. And so there's this societal expectation to just choose someone. And then maybe later you convince yourself that, yeah, that was actually the gunman. That was the robber. Even though it's highly possible that that person wasn't even present in the lineup. We know that another factor in eyewitness memory error are errors of attention and arousal, particularly what's known as weapons focus. Weapons focus. This is an ironic finding that when a weapon is fired, when a gun is shot, memory is worse for the event. So we can see here in orange is percent of details correctly recalled. So the higher the bar, the better the memory. About the perpetrator, about the victim, and about the weapon. And in orange are situations when the gun was fired. And in green are situations when the gun was not fired. So memory is actually better for the event when the gun isn't fired. The idea here being that the firing of the gun is a emotionally and physically sort of sudden, arousing, intense event. It garners your attention. It takes your attention away from everything else that's happening. And as such, your memory decreases in accuracy for the event. We can also get source monitoring errors from this. People will misidentify the robber as someone else who was just there. So if you imagine someone robs a convenience store, people will often misidentify customers as the robber because they're making mistakes about the source of that information. The customer looks familiar because they were a customer at the convenience store. They weren't the robber, but they were in the video. They were there. And so when people see them at a later date, maybe in a lineup, then they misattribute that familiarity to that person being the perpetrator, to that person being the robber. As we discussed before, this can be a problem with suggestive questioning by either law enforcement or lawyers. This is particularly relevant when interviewing children. It's very easy to get children to make claims that are untrue. Children they have a bias towards agreeing with adults. They'll just say, okay, sure, yes, uh-huh, yes, yep, you're right, yes. They want to please adults, and so they just have this bias towards agreement. So if you really wanted to, you could lead a child, and you can also do this with adults, you can lead them down a path of suggestive questioning until you end up with a statement that is probably not true, or that has many untrue elements to it. And then, of course, if the person doing the interview gives you confirmation, right? They say, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, good job. This is exactly what we need. Keep going. Yeah, more details. What else can you remember? This is great. You're helping us out so much. We're gonna put this guy behind bars." That confirmation, right, only enhances the strength of the memory. It only makes you want to help more and to provide that eyewitness testimony, even though it can be open to suggestion and error. And so we can see here an experiment done showing that when you receive confirmations, so good, you identified the suspect, people rate their confidence as being higher than if they receive no feedback or negative feedback, even though they were not identifying the correct suspect at all. So, what can we do? I mean, the APA, the American Psychological Association, has a whole list of suggestions for how to improve eyewitness testimony. It was developed by memory researchers, by cognitive psychologists. And there's a lot of things that good policing and good sort of the sort of appropriate application of the legal system should be doing in regards to the way that we interview people, the way that we conduct lineups, the way that we ask people questions in a timely manner about what they've witnessed. Unfortunately, there are no rules or laws at a national level that govern the way that these things are done. In general, the legal system in different areas of the country has broad flexibility to engage in these practices however they would like. They can follow the recommendations made by the experts, but they don't have to in many cases. And so until we have this sort of reckoning with the issue of eyewitness testimony, we're still going to see these negative effects from false memories or memories that were tweaked and made an error due to suggestibility. So that's the end of chapter 8. Thanks everybody for listening to Everyday Memory and Memory Errors. I think this is a really important lecture and a really applicable and interesting one. It's always a fun one to give and I hope to learn about. So thanks again, and I will see you for our next chapter.